And now a moment from Your History and Health Comes First with Dr. Richard Brown.
Welcome to this week's podcast. Your History and Health Comes First by Dr. Richard Brown. Today is June the 6th, 2 days after the Independence Day, the 4th of July. And how was it celebrated? Lots of firecrackers and fireworks and celebration everywhere. But sadly enough, it had to be celebrated by another mass shooting of innocent people in Illinois. It seems that almost every day, every week, we're having to talk about another mass shooting, another situation in which guns and gun violence has taken the life of some people in this country. And we're the country who has the largest numbers of gun violence in the world. And it's just something wrong about that, something wrong about us supposedly being free when we aren't free to go to theaters or the mall or church or to a parade without being fearful of being shot by somebody who has one of these guns, legal or illegal, who wants to exert their right to shoot other people. And it's really sad, and we've got to do something about this. But specifically, this broadcast and podcast today, I want to talk about some history on racial violence. We know that there's been violence perpetuated on Black folk and other minorities for years and years, but it was only through my research that I knew how much it was. Violence in America has shaped the current social and political climate in the United States, the so-called United States. Clearly, we are a divided group of people in these states. But this description of racial history that I'm going to talk about was sparked by me hearing and seeing the murders that took place in Buffalo, where 10 African Americans were killed on May 14th, 2022. And this was at the Tops grocery store. And this was by an 18-year-old white supremacist and a domestic terrorist named Peyton Gendron, who was from Conklin, New York. So let me say up front in advance, from my opinion, this was not about mental illness or mental health. This is about a continuation of the historical influence of racism in America, to include the right-wing extremist groups, politicians, social media. It's coming from everywhere. So the historic account of racial violence that I'm going to talk about comes from a CNN report published on May 30th by Shannon Hodge and 8 other authors. It was entitled "Burned from the Land: How 60 Years of Racial Violence Shaped America." So most of us know some history of America, and we know that there was a Civil War. And at the end of the Civil War, the Union general named William Sherman, he had been convinced that nearly every emancipated slave needed to have their own land to secure their own freedom. And he issued a special field order, number 15. And this order set aside 400,000 coastal acre land for Black families. And this was along the coast. It was only for Black families. And he said that no white person, unless they're military officers or soldiers, could be permitted to occupy on this land. It was all for the slaves who had been freed as a result of winning the Civil War. And then later on, he talked about adding a mule. Thus, we get the 40 acres and the mule that you hear about. But within 3 months of that declaration by Sherman, it was vanished. It was destroyed. It went away. Again, with a single shot from a gun. Again, violence by guns. And we know what that single shot was. It was the shot that killed Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln got shot, and so the promises that were made to Black folk was erased. And so then we got President Andrew Johnson. He reversed that order. and he allowed the Confederates to regain that land. It demonstrated a ruthless appropriation that would be repeated for decades to come. That kind of thing is still going on. And all while this was going on, still Black Americans created pockets of wealth during the Reconstruction years and into the early 20th century. And yet, where Black Americans created a refuge, white Americans pushed back. That include the politicians and their maneuvering and the violence. So this year, 2022 marks the centennial of one of the most horrendous attacks on Blacks in America. And many of you know now about the story of Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma. So this was a shining city within a city. Greenwood was home to grocery stores, retail stores, theaters, restaurants, hotels, doctor's offices, all these businesses and services that Black folk needed were there. They created it. It was segregated from the white population because that was the law, segregation at that time. So Black folk created their own space with all the goods and services that they need. So the Greenwood streets were lined with stately mansions, doctors and dentist offices, business tycoons, as well as the more modest dwelling of domestic workers. And it was so prosperous, it became known as Negro Wall Street. Now, I had the opportunity to visit this earlier this year in March, and it was amazing to see where this community lived. And there's a museum that's been created, and it showed the history and talked about the businesses. And you could actually see where these buildings in this community was torn down and burned to the ground, actually. So the affluent Greenwood area that was created, this tied into the turmoil between Black Tulsans and white Tulsans. And there was an anthropologist that actually said that from the University of Tulsa, who actually said that the dreamland, the burning of Black Wall Street, says that it was all about perspective. White Tulsans talked about Greenwood as Little Africa or Niggerland. However, from the African and Black standpoint, they had all that they needed. It was a great society that met all of their needs. So 100 years ago, on May 31st, 1921 is when this took place. That racial animosity became fuel for this massacre. So here's what happened. And it's a familiar story because it happened in a lot of places. They make up stuff, usually about some white woman being harmed. But a lynch mob formed in downtown Tulsa after a 19-year-old Black man was accused of assaulting a white woman. That night, thousands of white Tulsans launched an all-out assault on Greenwood with rifles, machine guns, torches, and aerial bombings from private planes. I mean, this community was the only community that's ever been bombed by airplanes or bombs that came from an airplane. There's no other bombs been launched and rained down on citizens and people in America except this Black community back in 1921. So this rampage lasted all afternoon and into the night and into the next morning. 10,000 Black Tulsans became homeless and their communities were burned down to nothing but ashes and rubble. It's still unknown exactly how many people were killed, but it's estimated about 300 lost their lives in this massacre. It was one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history. And it was part of a large pattern of assault. This was happening in a lot of other places during that time. And the authors that were involved in this story estimated that there were upwards of 100 massacres that took place between the end of the Civil War in the 1940s. Duke University economist stated that reparations for Blacks should have taken place, but did not. And so they look back, when they went into this, they look back at the research and the news clippings, and they paid particular attention to the area around that they determined that about 50 racially charged incidents between 1863 and 1923 took place where Black folk lost their property, lost their economic opportunity. So the events highlighted here revealed how acts of racial violence of different scope played out across the country and targeted various ethnicities. Historians then helped us examine how and why they had occurred and where we still see this impact today. So, the South lost the war, but the South's response to losing that war was that we're going to win the race war. And see, the war was about race and about slavery. The current history books don't say that. They don't say that it was about slavery, but it truly was about slavery. The South wanted to maintain slavery, and the North said, no, it's inhumane, and we need to stop that. So the South's response to losing the war is that we will win the race war, and they're still fighting it. Peyton Gidron stated that the shooting of the Black people in Buffalo was an attempt to start a race war. He did the shooting, and he said that was what his purpose was. And this is 150 years later, we're still trying to start a race war. So the NRA is constantly pushing gun ownership, Republican politicians protecting the NRA and pushing gun ownership. Gun sales go up every time there's a mass shooting. Goes up every time. So racial violence is not an accident in this country, but a deliberate attempt to divide the so-called United States of America. And believe me, you can probably see it on your own. It is becoming increasingly divided. So the achievements of Black Americans made them vulnerable to attack, said Trina Shanks, a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute. If Blacks were successfully and actually were visibly prosperous, that made them a target. That's a quote. Some of the violence might have been triggered by this economic envy, said Shanks, the director of community engagement at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. She explained that some white Americans thought that, and I quote, how can we make sure that we reserve these economic benefits and opportunities for whites and our children and push back Blacks so that there can be more for us? So they intentionally said, we need more of the power, more of the economic benefit. So how can we push Blacks back? How can we create an environment where they do not advance? Sounds like philosophy of the KKK, right? KKK is an American terrorist organization. And we know there's many others, the Proud Boys and Gatekeepers, some other names that are out there that have the sole purpose of destroying Black folk and their progress. So this dynamic played out in Wilmington, North Carolina, where many Black Americans achieved economic success for several decades in the late 1800s. They worked through the major port city as professionals, skilled artisans, and industrial workers. They formed building and loan associations. They built libraries, they created baseball leagues. During the 1870s and 1880s, some Black businessmen and entrepreneurs amassed a lot of wealth, rivaling that of many whites. And this is according to the 2006 historical report produced by the 1899 Wilmington Race Riot Commission, which was created by the state's General Assembly. So they were gaining political power too, having an impact of multiple elections in the 1890s and securing seats in city government. But as Blacks increased their political and financial capital, many white residents grew increasingly angry and organized to regain control of the city. So it came to a head just after the November 8th election in 1898. And we're hearing about elections in November, past and future. So the white Democrats in Wilmington forced the residents to leave town. They forced the resignation of the city's white mayor. Local government members of both races launched a coup. We've heard about a coup. An attempted coup took place on January 6, 2022 in America, but this is not new. A coup was launched back in 1898. So they forced the white mayor out, they removed the Black employees from their municipal positions, and at least 60 members of the city's Black community were killed, according to the News and Observer. While some have estimated a death toll into the hundreds, more than 2,100 Black residents fled, and the homes of at least 1,500 Black people were then taken by white residents at low cost. Here's some more history to demonstrate violence that have taken place in America against Black and minority people. 1863, Detroit, Michigan. On March 6, 1863, a tavern owner named William Faulkner was found guilty of sexually assaulting who? What? A white girl. Outside the courthouse, mostly white crowd clashed with officials and they tried to attack Faulkner. When they couldn't, they roamed the streets of Detroit, attacking African Americans, and setting buildings on fire, which left nearly 200 Black residents homeless. Local newspaper had called Faulkner a Negro, although Faulkner said he was Spanish Indian. Faulkner's accusers later recanted and he was released from prison, as noted by the researcher Matthew Gundinger. 1875, Clinton, Mississippi. On September 4th, 1875, between 1,500 and 2,500 people, most of whom were newly enfranchised Black Republicans and their families, gathered at a site of a former plantation. And they were there for a picnic and for a political rally ahead of the election. A white Democrat who had been invited to the event heckled the speaker, inciting a fight. So the white Democrats turned their weapons on the crowd and started firing. In the days after the presumed race riot became a massacre. So hear what I'm saying. This is a group of Black Republicans who came together at a previous plantation to hold a political rally. White Republicans, white Democrats opened fire on the Black Republicans. You see what's happening here? Doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican. If you're Black, you can get attacked by both, because that is the factor that is so dangerous to them, it seems. So this result, where white people benefited in an aftermath of violence, repeats itself into the 20th century in places like Ocasee, Florida, where a successful Black laborer attempted to vote in 1920. This sparked a massacre so violent that Black residents abandoned their properties. Within a month, their land was advertised for sale at special bargains by a Confederate veteran, the Orlando Sentinel found. So the racial violence during and after Reconstruction between whites sought to maintain their supremacy, maintain their economic power, their political power, their social power. And it's still happening today. That's what this is about, maintaining power, not letting it get into the hands of Blacks and other minorities. Another situation, 1917, East St. Louis, Illinois. July 2nd, 1917, a white mob stoned and murdered a Black person indiscriminately. They murdered several people indiscriminately on the streets of East St. Louis, Illinois, across the river from where I was born in St. Louis. The mob killed nearly 50 people and drove 6,000 from the city. The mob formed because a white man in a Ford who had been shooting into the Black homes was found and seen coming back to do some more shooting. So Black residents armed themselves and they fired shots at the two men that was approaching and shooting into Black homes. And they killed them. But those two men turned out to be what? Who? Police officers. This was reported by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. 1919, Corbin, Kentucky. There's more. Known for being the birthplace of the Kentucky Fried Chicken, Corbin is still grappling with its history as a sundown town. You may know that a sundown town is a town where Blacks cannot be on the streets after sundown. On October 31st, 1919, an armed mob forced out hundreds of Black residents, bringing in extra rail cars to send them out of town. They just rounded them up, put them on a train, and sent them out of town. And from that point on, Black people were known not to go to Corbin. It was known as a sundown town. Black folk decided they were not going to be there. And they did not need to be there because they knew that their lives would be threatened. 1923, Johnstown, Pennsylvania. After 4 police officers were killed during a shootout with a Black man, the mayor ordered all Black and Mexican people who had lived in Johnstown for less than 7 years to leave the area. He relied on the KKK to enforce the order, which he said wasn't directed toward Johnstown law-abiding Black population. An estimated 2,000 Blacks and Mexicans were forced out. Though these massacres happened many decades ago, the impact was widely spread and long-lasting, and it can still be felt today. So, as we look at the recent racially motivated shootings that continue to happen in this country, we see the pattern that continues by both hate groups, by all of the hate groups periodically. And all of the shooters are usually young white males who have access to military style weapons. Some of them have been claimed to be mentally ill, claimed to have had a troubled past. But some of them have not. Some of them have intentionally launched shootings of Black people because, as was stated, they wanted to start a race war. And they're accumulating weapons all the time, every day. As I mentioned, every time there's a shooting, there's an increase in the number of purchases for weapons. And I think it's happening by white folk, by conservatives, by liberals, and by Black folk. Everybody's buying guns because of this environment that's been created that says it's not safe out here anywhere. And so gun violence in this country is massive. It is of an epidemic proportion. But America must face the reality that in the last 6 months to a year, there's been 300 mass shootings in America, with almost 1,000 people killed or wounded. Such racially motivated hate cannot be endured by a nation that claims that it is for peace, equality, and security for all. And maybe it's because it never was intended to be peaceful. It never was intended to be equal for everybody. And certainly, security for all does not exist. So I believe that all available resources to eliminate racial and ethnically motivated violence and extremism must be utilized. These resources must include legislative support, judicial support, civic support, organizational support, and individual efforts if we're going to ever get beyond this violent society that we live in. And so once again, I say to you, your history and your health comes first and is very important. This is Dr. Brown, and I'll see you around.
This has been Your History and Health Comes First with Dr. Richard Brown. And you can leave suggestions at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.